take questions from the floor, rounds of 3. And please do state your name, or if you're from a particular organisation, it'd be great, or a particular trade or profession. And if you can also state who the question is directed to. And for those of you at home, I think the best thing for you to do is to put a question into the chat box, if that makes sense, in the comment box. I'm not really familiar with this sort of stuff, but I think we will pick up somehow, and then I can direct it to our speakers here. Okay, so without ado, let's have a raise of hands. There's one hand. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, go for it.
Aside from the fact that this is quite a good attempt at polishing its hair, which I understand is not possible, the issue to do with the university and the fact that conversation was shut down, where is the legal obligation for the university to listen to a prevent officer from outside of the university? That's the first question. And why is it, if there isn't such an obligation, that the university wasn't more robust in its own duty to actually allow freedom of speech to be effective according with its duty as it perceives it and its functionalities in achieving a safe space to do that?
So, I mean, the legal scholars amongst you might correct me on this, but it's my understanding that there is no legal duty for a university to listen to a particular prevent officer. However, it's the case that although there are a number of private sector providers of prevent training making money out of this, some of which are connected to the Conservative Party, quite a lot of the training that's being done in universities, as I understand it, is being done by regional prevent coordinators. And so, although people say, you know, you can't have these cowboy providers of prevent training because they come and do all this racist stuff. Well, you know, actually, the stuff from the Home Office is pretty bad. The examples I was quoting were from someone from the Home Office. So there's no requirement, but of course, the training is offered to all universities, and most universities, as far as I understand it, are taking up the offer of both of training on campus and then of specific advice on the minutiae of particular academic conferences, right? And that's extraordinary that they should be doing that. We only discovered that through FOI and then ask them to unredact stuff they had blacked out. So there's no duty, but equally, the duty to promote equality is a stronger duty than the duty to promote prevent, as I understand it. But I don't know any university in the country which is saying we're not going to implement prevent because it interferes with our duty under the Equality Act. Now, they should be doing that, but they're not. There have been some university vice-chancellors who've come out against prevent. Louise Richardson's one of them. The guy at Kingston, yes, another one, Julius Weinberg, yeah, has come out against it. But they're kind of against it in a liberal fashion. They're not against it in the sense that we're not going to comply with this. And there's no university that said they will not comply with it. As you'll know, the University and College Union and the NUS has policies, quite strong policies against it, but the practical way in which that can be done is very difficult because the way in which it's implemented in universities is to change the freedom of speech policy so that they then have a process to go through where you've got to check out which individual speakers they've got to go through, particular grids and tick them off, etc., and put in mitigation in case they might be risky, like having security on the door or chairing them effectively. So that's all an issue. But the experience. This is how it works, right? This is how censorship works. The experience that we have, for example, in this country with that kind of approach, the best example, I think, previously was the broadcasting ban on Sinn Féin and other Irish organisations between 1988 and 1994, when the BBC and the ITN and other broadcasters had to determine on the one hand, whether someone was representing one of the organisations, whether it was a person who was on talking about mushrooms or making wine, were they representing Sinn Féin when they were talking about that? Those are real examples. Or were the words that they were using likely to invite or solicit support for a banned organisation? It's very similar to the wording in prevent. And of course, what happened then was that the BBC themselves were very cautious about that. And although they did put on, and people say now, well, they put subtitles on that, that was the journalists pushing back against it. Well, no, it wasn't. They tried, BBC in particular, especially tried to minimise the possibility that we would see that censorship was operating. And in the year after the broadcasting ban came into place, there was a decline of 53% in appearances of Sinn Féin. I know that because that was a study I did. One of the first studies I did back in 1989, right? So that's what happens, is that the public bodies like the BBC or like the universities or nurseries or opticians are cautious. They don't have the political nous or the will to resist in that kind of way. And they will not drive resistance against this. The only place that it's possible to drive resistance is places where individuals and organisations and groupings will defy and resist and refuse. And the best possibility, guess where, is amongst the students. And we can already see this with the NUS under Malia, Boatia, and of course that's why Malia is being traduced and defamed and lied about by the Home Affairs Select Committee and by the Zionist movement. Am I allowed to say that anymore? And other similar organisations. So that this is a real moment, because it's not just that we're talking abstractly about the pre-crime and about the effect it's having on campus and other places, which is really negative, but also about what happens when people campaign or protest about it. And what happens then is that they're gone for attack. They took out Nash Shah from the Home Affairs Select Committee, so she couldn't be on this. They're going for Malia, they're going for Corbyn. I mean, I can give you the list, right? And that's the process. And so the question really, for me, really is not why don't the universities resist more? I mean, I'd like them to, but how can we build the pressure so that it becomes possible for universities to take a step towards that?
Just to come back on that, the university has a dual legal obligation. Yeah. It's failed in one of those by an outside factor that's not of relevance to their decision making, and that would mean that they could be judicially reviewed. Then takes an organisation to.
It does. And of course that's happening. But you say a dual, just to say one thing more about that. I've mentioned the Equality Act, but of course there is also under the Education Act the question of academic freedom. So, it does breach academic freedom in a way which universities could be standing up much more for. And so judicial review will be part of that. But I think also we need resistance on the ground to these processes being enacted.
So just to come up one more time. The Prevent Officer himself is a public servant and is therefore subject to Prevent as a duty as well, himself in his own decision making. The fact that he stifled a fundamental British value means he should report himself to himself, and the failure to do so would then also be an omission of his part.
I thought about that. That's brilliant.
Yes, well, I look forward to the day when that happens.
Okay, there's two questions here. I'll take this question first, and then next. Yeah.
So in terms of students, I know that certain unions are condemned with Prevent. What else can we do, and what's the best way to communicate with academics at universities to work against this?
Well, the best way to communicate with academics is to speak to the network of academics who are active in the union and who are active in preventing Prevent and in contact with students, not suspects. If you want to know who they are, let me know and I'll put you in touch with anyone. What can the students do? Well, I think the next step. Students are good at doing things like occupying and breaking the rules. So that's what they've got to do. You've got to break the rules, and that means refusing to go through the processes of securitizing the whole freedom of speech question, refusing to clear their speakers. I mean, if you have a student occupation, you're not going to during the occupation say, by the way, can we have Mosaic come and speak to it? Is that okay? See, I mean, that's the way it has to be done, isn't it? And that if the government then comes down on that would be an interesting day, because that would be really difficult for them. So because otherwise what will happen is that people will go along with the freedom of speech policy, and people will be banned quietly or silently. Sometimes if it's someone important or a celebrity that might get into the news, but the policies will be embedded in place, and people will get used to operating through those policies. And so that will become the new common sense, unless it's disrupted, and that means breaking the rules. in the service of the greater rules, which of course is academic freedom and freedom of speech.
The issue is that we're going to have as part of any type of movement against prevent is one of coercion, right? That's what we're really facing here, because the government constantly presents prevent as being this kind of voluntary system. It's about soft touch. It's about kind of communities coming together and protecting themselves. But really, in every single layer, what's built in is this kind of fallback of coercion that exists within the legislation that allows them to put pressure. So, for example, they could go to a Muslim school, an independent school. They've just brought them within the Counterterrorism and Security Act as well. And they could say to them, you haven't reported any of your children to prevent, we're worried about your safeguarding policies. We wonder why, can we come in and have a look around? So they should send in HM Inspectorate through Ofsted. They'll do a complete review. Then somebody like, what's his name? Clark, Richard Clark? OSCT officer. Richard Clark, yeah. He'll come along and he'll say, well, we found so many cases of extremism and so on and so forth in this school, and so we need to change the board of governors and so on and so forth, right? The element of voluntary involvement or engagement in prevent goes, because that threat will always exist. And all schools that I know of personally operate on that basis, that we're under a duty, and if we don't comply, then the Home Secretary can force our hand. And that's why Cage was castigated, because when we read the Counterterrorism and Security Act, we looked at it and it said that channeling is voluntary, okay, that consent is required of either the individual if they're above the age of 18, or from the individual's parents if they're below the age of 18. We have to get consent to put them through this de-radicalization program. It's consent-based, and they keep on saying that. You don't understand, prevent and channel, they're consent-based. It's not about coercion, except the sub-clause that comes directly after that says, where consent cannot be obtained, the panel that is convened with the bespoke de-radicalization program can look at options within the health and social services. So when we said that opens the door to taking children away, we were castigated as fear-mongering. And of course, we now have, I think over 30 cases where the courts have tried to decide on whether or not children should be taken away from their parents. The point is that if the legislation allows for that coercion, it stops becoming a voluntary system, which is exactly what the CTS Act does. There is no room. And that's why what David is saying is right. The only way to resist it is through kind of these actions that have to take place in order to kind of to nullify its effect. Where that coercion kind of sits in the ether, you have to reduce the effectiveness of that coercion by saying that we will not be coerced into kind of engaging in this kind of state-sanctioned spying or whatever else.
I was going to say that here the prevalent narrative seems to be that we in the West are the victims of these sort of terrorist extremists, and it's actually, isn't it the case that I think most of the victims of terror, if there is a word, implied, are Muslims themselves, both at the hands of bona fide violent extremists, or of the right or otherwise. And the other question is that we talk about we're critical of prevent. And then the question that comes upon us is that, well, if not prevent, then what? My answer to my question, I suppose, and about your comments, is would we be better served following the money? Because the thing is that we have to acknowledge as a community that Wahhabist ideology has filtered through, from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan and places like that, and has caused issues in Pakistan, which is my home country. Mm-hmm. I've seen it myself. My cousin was kidnapped. We had to pay ransom to get him out, etc., etc. And there's all sorts of stuff there, which everybody knows about in the public domain. And wouldn't be better served talking about how follow the money back through the CIA to the countries that are funding terrorism, either directly or indirectly. Sure, comments on those two points.
You want to go? So, I mean, the issue of ideology, I think it's, one that we have to deal with because obviously, we live at a time where there is a whole range of views on a number of issues. The question is, what role does ideology play? Okay, to what extent is it a significant factor? Does political violence exist in the world because of ideology? Is it a causal factor for it? I don't think there's enough data for us to be able to come to conclusions about that or even say specifically that's the reason. What we do know, okay, is that every single case of either an act of political violence or an intended act of political violence here in the UK, and I can't remember the exact numbers, it came up to around 30 odd cases. At Cage, we studied all of those cases, and every single one of them, while the religious backgrounds varied, from different schools of thought, what was equal amongst all of them was foreign policy was there on every single occasion as a justification. So you look at whether it's Dr. Bilal Abdullah, the 7/7 bombers, the 28/7 guys, or whoever it was, right? There was a commonality between all of them. Okay, and what we're suggesting there is that there are some factors that are more. We're not excluding ideology, okay, but if you look at experts such as Professor Mark Sageman, while I disagree with some of the findings and conclusions that he comes to, ultimately, even he says that ideology is the very, very kind of last thing that comes into it. It's almost just like a vehicle in the end, but really everything that comes before it's political, it's grievance-based, okay? There was only one case here in the UK where there wasn't really a foreign grievance that was in it. That was the EDL bomb plot. It was a domestic one, right? And we've actually been tracking that for a while. And you'll notice in Cage's narrative for the last few years, we've been saying actually domestic grievance has risen more significantly than grievance based on kind of foreign intervention issues. So I think that, it's important that we track these things. As I say, we can't exclude ideology completely, but if you were to put all the factors on the table, okay, just put every single factor that there is to do with somebody feeling like they might want to do something, okay, and you take everything except grievance off, is that person still potentially capable of doing something? Reverse that, take all the factors off and just leave ideology, that's it. So the guy reads whatever literature he reads. Is that enough? Would you say that person, he's read this book, he read that book and read that book, feels no sense of grievance whatsoever, is that person now going to go off and blow himself up on the streets of London? I would suggest probably not, okay, that, those other factors are more significant, okay? I don't have any empirical evidence to say that, but it'd be very difficult for me to believe that somebody would simply blow themselves up because they read a book, whether it's by Sayyid Qutb or Abdullah Azam or whoever, right? There have to be all this other kind of context and factors to be taking place. And really, we should be listening to the words of the people who are involved themselves. They tell us every single time. I'm still yet to come across the guy who carries out a bombing who says, I just read Abdullah Azam's Defense of the Muslim Lands and Sayyid Qutb's Milestones, and I really feel like blowing myself up now. Usually it's like, I see what you do in Iraq, I've seen what you do in Afghanistan, I've watched the pictures coming out of Abu Ghraib, and, I feel like this is my only kind of option left, or this is the way that I'm going to make you understand the pain that my people feel through, right? So I don't think we should get too obsessed with ideology, because that kind of starts to displace, where the real points of contention are. And if we start going out after that specifically, in almost like a vacuum to everything else, we actually betray the grievances that these young people feel, right, which are largely political, or at least in our view are largely political.
I take your point that obviously we don't let them off the hook either, the people that are responsible for the...
There's lots of people on. There's lots of people on the hook for this, right? Yeah. So I think
it's not a question of hooks really. It's really more a question of understanding why, in order that we can make sensible decisions about how we stop the violence. Right? And that's the question. It's not, for me, it's not a question of what we morally feel about the actions of people who engage in political violence on whatever side. It's more a question of how is it that we can resolve this issue? And I think what the first thing one would say in relation to that, I think it's the most important issue in relation to political violence, is that you want to stop terrorism, stop committing it. The biggest amount of terrorism in the world today is caused by the US. The UK is pretty good too at killing civilians with its sophisticated weaponry, which is produced by Rolls-Royce and BAE Systems, etc. If you want to stop people committing terrorism against us, stop killing them. It's straightforward, and people are outraged when you say that. And I get that, because it's like it's something which is completely against their understanding of how the world is. But actually, let's look at the evidence. Let's look at who it is that kills people in the world and how they do it. The industrial means used by the West to kill wedding parties and people who randomly flit across their computer screens. I'm not taking any lessons from anyone who talks about terrorism and fails to mention the civilians and the crimes of the West. These are simply empirical facts. But the second thing I would raise is, this question of if not prevent, what? Well, what is the thing which prevent is supposed to do? What is the evidence base for the threat which we allegedly face, which prevent is supposed to cure? And actually, when you look at the evidence, I don't even talk about that study, but if you look at the evidence base, what evidence is there that there is a really serious threat? No one even says it's a threat to national security, like national survival, like it was in the Second World War or whatever. No one says that. I mean, it's not. It's not even a patch on a threat faced by this country in relation to the provisional IRA in the period of the 70s and 80s. So you have to say, well, what is the evidence base for that? And of course, we don't know the evidence base because it's secret. They won't tell us. And when we actually find out some of the evidence base, it's not an evidence base, frankly. But let me say something more about that. The question about what is the threat. We've seen since 9/11 successive Home Secretaries, Prime Ministers, heads of MI5 and 6 talk about the really severe and significant threat from the Muslims, right? And you look at that, we track this in the press. They don't tell you this on the record or in handily sourced press releases with footnotes, which ASIM will then follow up. Instead, what you get is security sources have told us that there are 60 active bomb plots by Al-Qaeda in Britain today. And you can see, when you track that in the press, the only way you get to know what they say is the threat. When you track that, you can see how they change. And they go down to 20, and then the next day they're up to 60, and then 5 months later they're down to 4. And you think, well, so there were 20, and then there were 60. And then, so what happened to the 30? No one's been blown up, no one's been arrested. Where did they go? And that, for me, raises a question of what kind of evidence base they're operating with, a question which is then answered to some extent by those cases that we do know about, the cases where there was an alleged threat, such as in the East End of London. You'll recall early in the morning where those two brothers in Forest Gate, where the intelligence services were acting on really important intelligence, really urgent intelligence about a chemical weapon. And what happened there? Well, there wasn't a chemical weapon. It was faulty intelligence. And then they said that one of the brothers had shot the other brother, and then it was the police who'd done it, and it was his gloves, the wrong gloves, And then they brought out the evidence that one of the brothers had child pornography on his computer. Oh, and then, no, he didn't. Sorry about that. So when you look at examples like that, and there are others, let's not even mention Charles de Menezes, there are other examples where threats turned out not to be as significant as they were said to by the intelligence services or whoever it was who briefed the press, someone in the security establishment. Then you start to see that the threat is actually definitely less than they say it is. And then you start to, I'm going to finish soon, and then you start to get the kind of evidence we're now getting, that we've seen recently, and Simon's been reporting this recently, of the US spending $500 million to create fake jihadi websites, Facebook profiles, Twitter accounts. And you think, well, how much of the threat that we're seeing comes from fake accounts? And then you think, well, hang on, is that happening here? And I've been to a briefing in this city in the Commons where officers from SO15, used to be known as Special Branch, got up and said, oh yes, we caught this guy because we used these fake Twitter accounts. And I said, no, that's interesting. And so presumably, you just did that couple of Twitter accounts and you got the guy and he said, no, we had to create tons of them. So the special branch are creating these fake accounts. And then, of course, there's the secret GCHQ propaganda unit, JTRIG, the Joint Threat Response Intelligence Group, which it was revealed through, not Bradley Manning, whose leak was that? Whose leak?
Snowden?
Yes, through Snowden. Yes, Edward Snowden, of course, sorry. Which revealed this secret unit inside GCHQ, which is itself, and there was a document from someone who's now Professor of Operation Research at Middlesex University, Professor Mandeep Dhami, again doing secret research for the Security Intelligence Services, who produced this document saying that the difficulty is that when people go on holiday or go away for the weekend, quite often the person who comes in to be their Facebook profile has a different grammar, and the suspects get suspicious. So they're creating huge amounts of Facebook and Twitter profiles. And how do we know how much of that is actually feeding into the perception of there being a risk? How do we know that's not actually one part of the strategy to heighten the sense of risk? Now, let's close on one example. Do you remember the example of the women in the audience, of Betty Bomber, the jihadi active on the streets of Glasgow who was going to kill the Queen? That's why she was called Betty Bomber, right? But it's clever, these people, aren't they? And this woman, who turns out not really to have existed, was discovered by the Sunday Times. And the Sunday Times had discovered this woman by pretending to be wannabe jihadis and contacting an ISIS recruiter, Sally Jones, she's called, isn't she, through her Twitter account. And when she allegedly said, "Do it," they went, "Oh, wow, we've got a story." And they went straight to the police and the intelligence services and said, "Look, we've got this book." And the intelligence services, rather than arresting the journalists and saying, "Well, you're plotting terrorism," they said, "Oh, that's jolly good." And they then revealed all the stuff in the press about this alleged person who was going to be on the streets of Glasgow trying to kill the Queen, recruited by Sally Jones. Transparently, this is a figment of one of their fake accounts, right? Now, they don't tell us how much of that they're doing because it's a secret, and they don't want to admit that kind of stuff because it would look bad for them. So what I'm saying is, what is the threat that we face that prevent is the solution to? It's way less than they're saying it is. And of course, the difficulty is if we had a government which was just interested in finding evidence and having a discussion with us about that would be one thing. But we also have a government, didn't we already know this, which is engaged in propaganda. And that's the difficulty we've got. What's the solution to prevent a bullshit?
Well, they create their own empirical data, right? Because you've got these think tanks who will then kind of do all this social media survey, will use all these Twitter accounts and produce these amazing graphics, look how all these people are interconnected with one another. Okay, so if they've got 100 counts, okay, how do we know that 20%, 30%, 40%, 50% of them aren't actually kind of created accounts by the government, right? So, but by doing all of that work and kind of doing all this analysis and whatever else, they then provide a resource that acts as a piece of evidence to say, well, this is how we empirically know that jihadi networks
There
use
are 800 people in Syria.
Yeah. All right. I think there's a question back there. But
Sorry. Yeah. 1, 2. Yeah.
Thank you for a really interesting discussion. I have a question about prevent in a school context. You can probably imagine that in a school context, the anxiety and paranoia is magnified. As a school teacher, I attended training where I was basically told to look out for girls who choose to dress like me. Ironically, it was quite awkward to accept that. But my question is really about your advice for teachers who cannot bring this discussion to the school because it's unspeakable. I bet I've raised a lot of eyebrows when I gave feedback about the training that I've sat. And the other thing is, I appreciate your response to the question about if not prevent then what. But in a school context, things have to be very specific. So teachers are told about specific things that they need to look out for when identifying victims of abuse at home. And they keep in mind that teachers are from all different backgrounds. That the list has to be aimed at all teachers, regardless of their background, whether or not they know about political
issues surrounding terrorism and radicalisation. So, is there a temporary measure to take, from now until Cage manages to change the government policy?
We'll take them all in one go. Yes.
Obviously, you guys have mentioned the erosion of free speech, which is very concerning for everyone, society at large. But I think the ugliest face of prevent is shown at social service level, and that's probably the most disturbing level. The brother also mentioned coercion. When it gets to social services level, there's no such thing as coercion. It's blackmail. Coercion is too blunt a word. And your family facing pressure from not only the social services, but these core group meetings. You get counter-terrorism officers that have nothing to do. They're not trained in looking out for the welfare of 4-year-olds. No. And parents are not coerced. They're almost blackmailed. They're pressurised to a level that is unimaginable. That basically, if you don't work with prevent, if you don't work to the consent issue, it's just kind of there. It's just lip service. It's just paid to it. However, when it gets to that level, you're basically threatened with care proceedings eventually down the line. And you're talking about, they discuss propensity. Essentially, what we're saying is you're talking about propensity for a 4-year-old to go on to commit a terror offence based on, from personal experience, based on views of parents alone. And 4-year-olds are going through assessments and you might think this is bizarre, but you've got social workers who are actually saying, well, this 4-year-old potentially, when they grow up, could become a terrorist or an extremist or, whatever, follow the footsteps of whoever. And at that level, I mean, the free speech issue in universities, campuses, I understand, but when you're a parent and you're faced with the risk of losing your child, it's something that is so absurd. 20 years ago, not even 20 years ago, 5 years ago, you couldn't even imagine this kind of thing happening in 21st century Britain, where you're actually being threatened as parents with your children being removed from you just for having views. I've heard, conference chairs at these conferences with 21-year experience in social work saying that unless parents change their views and their outlook on life, on foreign policy, on domestic policy, unless they shift in parental views, then we're going to consider care proceedings. So what, unless, this is largely going unchallenged apart from Cage. But I think that everyone, it might be tomorrow, it might be your children. What are we going to do as a society to prevent this from happening? And there's not enough awareness about this. You've mentioned 30 cases. I can look around this room, and I'm not going to expose someone, but I've just seen 3 people that I know that are going through this. Yeah. So this is becoming very widespread and very common, and it's very, very dangerous. There's no media attention being paid to this kind of area. The social services thing, the prevent campaigns are excellent when it comes to the student level, freedom of speech. But when it comes to families who are being torn apart, little children whose lives are being turned upside down, I don't really hear the voices, and that's essentially why I'm here today, to create awareness and to see how Cage can help.
Thank you.
So hopefully I can help provide some answers, because what you've exposed there is exactly the reason why it's incumbent upon students at universities, academic and general staff at universities, the students and the teachers at schools to be protesting and to stop prevent there, because stopping prevent there stops it everywhere, because the vulnerability, the difficulty that people, your clients or people you're working with in the group around this room, of course it's very difficult, it's almost impossible for people to struggle against these bureaucracies at these times of these personal crises. And that's why it's the duty within the university. I was up at the conference at Warwick for the weekend, which the students and staff put on there. I'd urge people to track down some people at Warwick and connect with them and others around the country, which David was saying earlier. And get involved. That's where the battles need to be fought. They were fought against all sorts of things over the years that happened in universities. In fact, they've been a little bit quiet over the last few years. This is an area we need to give people the space within which to campaign and win. And it's not just about occupation, because some people in some places might not be comfortable to do occupations. It's a whole suite of activities. We ran a workshop on direct action and governance and knowledge, all sorts of stuff on the weekend. Happy to share them all. And it's about maximising on the people who can get involved and spreading the word out. So people at the very pointy end, aren't those who have to struggle. It's not up to you to struggle. You're struggling enough with dealing with the consequences of this policy. It's up to others, because if we don't, then the next people down the line are people, you know, first they come forward, then they come forward, then they come for us past the minimum sense.
Thank you. Okay. Do you want to take the schools one? Or take the one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I take your points about that. I kind of agree, but also, I mean, there's a question of how people can collectively try and defend themselves at the point at which the abuse which is happening, and you know, maybe it's easier in schools than it is in social work, but obviously, I mean, the NUG has a policy. A good policy against prevent, and so I mean, one thing to do, and maybe it's the case in social work as well, is to join your union and to get active in your union, and that's part of the process. But of course, that doesn't necessarily help people where workplaces are not heavily unionised. But the other thing, of course, is to get involved with other organisations that are engaged in this activity, like Cage or Mend or others like that, and to take those cases on. I mean, I think Cage is good in the sense that it takes cases. Legal cases, and that's one way to hurt them. But you know, another way is to get people together to have collective protests about those kinds of issues in relation to the specific rules of the specific institution, both in terms of primary school education, secondary education, and in terms of social work. So that's some of the things I would say. These are not easy solutions, but you know, nevertheless, there are people active.
In terms of the family law issue, this is our next report. Inshallah, it'll be coming out fairly soon. We've done a whole kind of analysis of the way that this ERG radicalization theory stuff comes up in the courts again and again and again, and to devastating effect. To be honest with you, when we started looking at it, we had an idea that it was taking place. We had no idea about the extent or the difficulties that people were going through until we started really looking. And even then, you know, when you're reading case law and judgments, it's almost impossible to discern the human value. Judges have an amazing way of taking the human being completely out of their judgments. But there's two cases that I want to highlight from this report, actually. One is M children. They're all anonymized because in family law cases, they have to remove the identity of the child. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is the national security aspect. So for the first time last year or the year before, the president of the family law courts, Justice Munby, he issued guidance about public interest immunity in family law cases where children would be taken away from their parents. His view was that because there is a need to balance national security against the rights of the child, in certain cases, the government would be permitted to present its evidence in secret away from the parents and the lawyers for the parents or the child. So neither the parents nor the child nor their lawyers are permitted to see the evidence against them when the government presents. You're given a special advocate who represents your interests on your behalf. That special advocate is allowed to speak to you once before they go into the hearing, but after the hearing begins, after the government starts to present its evidence, they are no longer permitted to confer with you about what evidence they've seen. So you're basically fighting in the dark and hoping that your special advocate is a decent person who's willing to represent your interests. Case of M Children's interesting because in this case, the judge specifically says, if by radicalizing it's meant, as appears in this paragraph, that it's negatively influencing a child with radical fundamentalist thought which is associated with terrorism, then clearly that is a very different matter altogether. If any child is being indoctrinated or infected with thoughts involving the possibility of terrorism or indeed hatred for their native country, which is England, or another religion such as Christianity, which is the religion of their grandparents and now and again their mother, then that is potentially very abusive indeed and of utmost gravity. This is a case, by the way, in which the judge accepted that there was a very low risk of the children being in any kind of threat of being involved with terrorism. He says that himself. You juxtapose that with the case of a child, which is where the issue of ideology came up again. In this case, the president of the family law courts, Munby, says the mere fact, if fact it be, that the father was a member, probably only for a short time, of the English Defence League, is neither here nor there. Whatever one may think of its beliefs and policies, it is concerning to see the local authority again harping on about the allegedly immoral aspects of the father's behavior. Membership of an extremist group such as the EDL is not, without more, any basis for care proceedings. Okay? So just these two cases alone show a very different view that's taken by the courts when it comes to Muslims as opposed to non-Muslims. Personally, I'm of the view of Justice Munby. I think he got it right. Let me just make that clear in the case of the far-right individual. I don't think having ideas that are objectionable to other people is reason enough to take children away. Okay, you have to get to the threshold of actual harm, physical harm, or where the child will commit physical harm, right? So don't get me wrong. What I'm highlighting, though, is a double standard. Okay, so when they start talking about radical fundamentalist thought, okay, you have to place the use of that phrase within the larger swathe of court cases and legislation and policy, because you can't separate the two. They're producing policies in this document over here and giving judgments in this case over here, but the two are interconnected to one another. So when they use the word extremist or Islamist extremist in a policy document, it has a real world effect. So when, for example, Mahdi Hashi gets a letter through his parents' letterbox saying, we've removed your son's citizenship because he's an Islamist extremist, that actually means something in terms of the definitions. And the definitions are so vague that it could mean absolutely anything, right? But when it comes to a Muslim, it's applied in one way, and to a non-Muslim, it's applied in a completely different way. So, it's important that we hold this stuff to account, that we find out, okay, exactly how are you coming to your conclusions on these matters? What is your frame of reference? How do you know, for example, that one classic example is reading the works of Sayyid Qutb, which they have a particular problem with. How do you know, as a matter of science, that will cause somebody to become a violent terrorist? Okay, because that's what we're interested in. If we're interested in protecting society from physical harm, then you need to evidence how you know that's a fact. And what they say is that, well, this many people carried out plots in the UK, and about 70% of those people had copies of Sayyid Qutb's books on their bookshelves. And so that's how we know that there's a correlation between reading these books and being involved in terrorism plots. Except that's not the right data set. The right data set is every single person going back to the 1950s who ever read Sayyid Qutb's works all the way to now, and the number of people who have been involved in political violence out of that group. Okay, that's the correct data set. Okay, if you want to prove that literature has a link to violence. Okay.
You also need the corresponding data set, which is everyone who has not read.
Exactly.
So, and then you have to compare them to see if you've got a differential rate, right?
So I mean, the whole thing's just bizarre, right?
That's what you need.
And it's not scientifically, correct in the way that it's produced, and unfortunately, it leads to all of these abuses, particularly in the family law courts. And for me, there's nothing. There are no cases worse than that. Children being taken away from their families is absolutely disgusting, and especially on the basis that it's taking place.
Okay. Officially, we're out of time, but there are quite a few hands, so we'll need to make this very quick. Okay, so a quick fire round of hands and brief answers, and then we'll conclude. So it's 1, 2, 3. Okay. After you.
My name is Bishal Kari. I'm a solicitor dealing with prevent like for a couple of years. A couple of things. When you look at what we now have, and it's a question from the Crown, what's being said about Muslims in the definition of extremism and effectively compulsory secularization? I was looking back at what Bruno Bauer, the man who coined Judenfrage, the Jewish question, in 19th century Germany, was saying about Jews. And it's startling, if not alarming, similarity. That this minority, which was devoutly religious, was not worthy of European recognition as a human being of equal worth, absent renouncing their religiosity. This is what it is. And strip it down of all the other minor points. The definition of extremism is what? Vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values. The British component is a red herring, because they're no different from French values when it comes to the skeletons, or German. It's secular values. So my question is this: is the comparative fair? Because ultimately we're on a very, very slippery slope, a very dark place. I think this will link to this of the gentleman over there made the comment. First they came for one and then they came for the other. The original justification for secret trials for the Diplock courts in Northern Ireland, that was the jury, that was the court of that jury actually. The exception to the norm was made for the Irish Catholics. Then, when in the wake of 9/11, which was part of that, SIAC, the Special Immigration Appeals Commission, made the rule that you cannot keep such evidence as it may be identified by the Home Office to the accused, because that will compromise national security. The national security has been used first in terrorism context in Northern Ireland, then in dealing with immigrants being deported, and then it came to the secret criminal trials it had in the family court. So what was sold to us is a handful of horrible, evil people that want to harm you. Is now being applied to everybody. You mentioned the EDL case was a case in point. That the whole population will be affected by this. So this sort of, to come back, my question really is, am I right or am I being unfair when I substitute what was said about Jews in Judenfrage to what's being said about Muslims in modern Britain?
Thank you. Your question. Brief and concise if you can, please.
I wanted to know if there was really existing provision in legislation and in policy, say in the education sector, for things like safeguarding children from, being those who are vulnerable to falling into crime or any other similar kind of activity. I know terrorism, extremism, radicalization, all being treated as some sort of special category of crime. But are there already these provisions in place for children and young people, when it concerns their safeguarding?
Thank you. Your question, please.
This question about this advice in regards to, I'm going to speak about my own issue in regards to my 6-month-old. You've heard him, I do apologise. And I've got a 4-year-old now. My children are being removed from me. I don't know what I've done. I really haven't done anything, but they've been taken from me. I'm going to legal proceedings. I can't talk about it. I can't go to anyone. No one wants to talk to me. Everyone has closed their doors. What do I do? I haven't done anything. It's the father. I'm even with the father anymore. And I've got to prevent. They said that they're to support and help. I've never closed my door on anyone. Okay, you want to come in. They never told me they would prevent. They told me they were SO15. I got raided on the day that I gave birth to my child. In my birthing room, I still had blood dripping down my leg and still blood on my sheets. But I still kept quiet. Alhamdulillah. Okay. They took the father away. Fine. They came to my house that evening and raided my house. Okay, fine. Then a week later, social services come. They questioned me, respected them, they came in, fine. Then section 47, we're going to take your children away because you can't safeguard your children. But what have I done? It's the father. Okay, but you've got him, the father. You can't safeguard, we're just going to take the children away. Get yourself a good lawyer and get a good statement. Now, I can't say anymore, and I can't go to him. Every single person I've asked help for
Prevent have said to me that if I don't work with them, they're going to make my life difficult. They gave me a warning. They called me an E-day and gave me that warning. They've been constantly on my back. I can't do anything. Where do I go? Who do I go to? Who's going to defend me? I'm not a graduate. I'm a carer. I look after my mum and dad. They're ill. Who do I have? Now they're using my mother, her mental illness. Well, how are you going to look after your children if you've got a mother? I don't speak the way you guys speak. I can't miss that. I don't use the language. Who do I go to?
That's
Who
not
do
good.
I go to? Who's going to help me?
We're here for you, Charlotte, and there's good journalists here, there's good lawyers here.
I don't understand the child protection duty. I don't have a voice in the child protection. Everyone attacked me. Every single person, and my lawyer was next to me, my solicitor was with me. The minute she even looked at me, the chair lady was like, you need to stay quiet, you can't say anything. I can't fight back, I don't know how to fight back. What do I say? I'm scared to even say that I'm bringing my children up as a Muslim. I'm scared to even wear this.
That's what they want.
Tell me what I'm supposed to do. If I speak to people, they're Muslims, they're scared, everyone's scared. My friends are scared, my family are scared. People are scared to come and say, listen, they want to support me, but they're scared to support me in case their children get taken away.
I'm scared.
I think that everybody in this room is so moved by what you're saying.
There's a lot of people that are going through this.
Yeah.
I'm not going to, I can't use the language taking you, I'm not a graduate, I'm not scared to stand up, and I'm tired of it. The first day they raided my house, they put shotguns to my parents' house on their heads. But nobody cares. I'm just another file on a desk. Who's going to help?
Part of the reason we call this event is because, we knew and we specifically invited people that we wanted to get involved in this issue. So I'm really glad you've spoken up, because I think, all of this stuff, it's all just kind of academic, kind of abstract concepts, right? And you come along and everything that's inside this report, you've perfectly summarized in that brief intervention. And I think that there isn't a single person in this room who isn't going to say, look, how do we form some kind of committee to get behind you, to get you the support that you need? And I think that's one of the actions we should take away from this right now. So I don't know if you're already talking to somebody from Cage, but let's take your details. We're going to be in touch with you, inshallah. And whoever in this room wants to get involved and help out with this, and any of the other people in this room who are going through something similar to yourself, then inshallah we must start that. And I think that starts here tonight, okay? Because for me, even some of these things, they take a long time to produce and whatever else, and there's a lot of effort, a lot of hours that you take away from your family and whatever else. My wife said to me, she said, if I don't see you for the next year because you're working on this, trying to get people's kids back to them, then, don't worry about it. Because there's not a single person who hears about the fact that children are being taken away from their mothers and their fathers and from their homes and isn't moved by their plight. So inshallah, we will not abandon you, whatever the case. I don't know if you...
I support what you say, Hassan. I think it's just appalling. To your point about first they come from Jews, with the Jews with their funny hair and their funny hats, their funny ways of doing religion, it's the same. Of course it's the same. And we're in Northern Ireland was a testing ground, yes, but it's way worse now. We're now in a much worse situation, and we need to be aware of that, fight back.
Sorry, just to answer that question as well. There are existing provisions for all safeguarding, right? For bullying, for sexual violence. But in all of these situations, there's one key component that's missing, right? That the harm's already taken place. The whole point is that we have safeguarding policies because we can see harm, okay? Because the teacher can recognize, scientifically recognize that there's harm that's happened. And so it's important that, those teachers are given the tools to be able to recognize that. With this, what they're saying is that we want you to look out for something that may happen 50 years into the future, 10 years into the future, 1 week into the future, right? Where there is no actual sign of actual harm. It's up to the individual to make an assessment about whether or not there is that potential, okay? And that's what's dangerous about this, because, let's just take, for example, somebody who has a personal kind of political grievance with Muslims, okay, who reads the Daily Mail on a daily basis, right, and just, is kind of completely lost into that world. They're a teacher. They come across a Muslim child, okay, and they allow their prejudices to come through, in that. That's the problem with things like Prevent. Where the teacher is overly cautious already about Muslims, they will lean on the side of reporting. And let's make one thing clear as well. The reporting is an act of criminalization. They say it's not. It's pre-criminalization. It's about safeguarding. No. As soon as there is a file anywhere that is based on, kind of policing on a need to keep society safe, where you have a file on somebody with a domestic extremism database, you have criminalized them. Okay, that is very important for people to understand. We've got cases where there are files incriminant on children whose cases were dropped, but their files are still there. They're still in a domestic extremism database. So let's not just talk about criminalization as if it's the end product where somebody is convicted. As soon as you're reported and there is a file on you, you have been criminalized. And that's why it's important that we separate this notion of safeguarding from what Prevent is, which is a form of criminalization.
And can I just add, it's not that Prevent does this by accident. When you get the Prevent training, they tell you, trust your instincts, go with your instincts. And of course, that what they're saying is, trust your racist instincts, right? And that's how it works. It's not an accident that people fall into this by mistake. They're actually being told that they should do that by the Prevent trainers themselves. And these are people who are government officials who either work for local councils or for the police, and who provide the network of business innovation and skills. They used to be called Prevent regional trainers. It's deliberate, of course.
I mean, if you look at emergent events, there's more anti-Semitism in that than hatred. And some of these children are being taken into care that comes from their families. It's cautious justice, unfortunately, for people, but especially family proceedings. It's absolutely outrageous that such a irrational, inhumane, only speculative policy is taking root. It's taking very deep root unless we can try and stop it.
Absolutely. Ibrahim's just gone to deal with trying to gather together an ability. Anybody who wants to get involved. You heard the sister speak about her plight. I don't think that it's something that we can, or we have even an option to turn away from. So I think Ibrahim will sort it out outside. But if you're interested in getting involved, whatever skills that you have, whether you're a journalist or a lawyer or just even an activist, please do sign your name up, and we'll start some kind of committee, I'm sure, to help this sister, because and all the other families as well, for whoever else is having trouble. Ibrahim, have you said something up outside? Have you set something up outside, or? Okay, well, we'll set something up outside to do that. Okay. Do we? Yeah. Okay. Go for it. I think we have a little bit of time. Yeah.
With regards to the Orwellian society that we are definitely living in at the moment, I think the hatchet job. What part do you think the media plays on this? Because I think that the hatchet job was done on you for something that you probably mentioned as an aside as a background to what was a discussion about something, and they basically focused in on one thing and turned that into a big deal.
You live by the sword and you die by the sword, I guess. No, the media is the media. They will. they will always act according to their interests and the interests that some of their masters have. And unfortunately, we fall victim to that sometimes, but it hasn't stopped us yet.
Well, I mean, I think I don't agree with that. Yes, of course, there's the background and there's the question of how the media operates. But we're now living in a period of really acute conflict over the whole question of Palestine, of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia, which is coalescing through the threat which the Corbyn-led Labour Party poses to vested interests. And so, as I said before, it's no accident that Corbyn is the recipient of all this stuff, and that Malia is, that anyone who stands up and who defends the rights of the Palestinians, who criticises Zionism, a word which we're not allowed to use according to many sources now, and who stands up for basic human rights and civil liberties, the things which are supposed to be fundamental British values, etc., etc. I mean, there's no accident that's happening now. It's a really significant and serious conflict, which we've not seen, certainly not for 30 years, probably not. For a long, long time. And we see that conflict because the Corbyn-led Labour Party is a threat to the way of doing things. And so it's not just. We're not just in business as usual. We're in a very significant period. I think, and we're winning, right? And let's be clear about this. We're winning. I know it's lots of things. We're winning, and they are doing everything they can to try and disrupt that. But it's a very, very interesting period.
Sorry, Pervez had a question, and then maybe we'll.
Sorry.
Oh wait.
We're really, really, really out of time. So unless it's a genuinely quick-fire question, please go.
I think what I just wanted to add is basically what you've aired so far. I think generally the perception of the Muslim community on the ground, they have that perception of injustice, the double standards, the overall discrimination, and these raids and the focus on the Muslim community is happening for a long time now. And that opinion is set. It's a matter of translating that opinion to real action. And in the things we need to support those people who are coming out and engaging with yourself. We need to get that sensation and a campaign to launch in the community, because that sensation is there. People are saying what we're doing about it. They want to coordinate their actions together to do something on the ground. Because we talk about injustice around the world. We have charities collecting for funds and all that. But we've got injustice right here on our doorstep. We're seeing mothers like that where children are being pulled away on a daily basis. We see that up and down the country. I'm a governor in the school, and I'm seeing, in a Muslim school, I'm also involved with professionals in the city and so on. And I can we know about cases which are happening up and down the country. So when this is happening to us, we're just silent. We can't live a normal life when that is happening. How can we sleep at night when that is happening to one of our sisters, one of our mothers? And if there was any injustice, regardless of Muslim or non-Muslim, we should be standing up and airing this. And we should be standing, because that's what we believe in. Fundamentally, our belief calls us to stand up for it. If we don't stand up for it, we should be reflecting on our belief. What kind of belief do we have that we can't stand up for this injustice that is happening?
Just to add to that, sorry, there's a comment that's been given to me earlier on, which relates to the case of the mother. On the issue of social workers in particular, saying that social workers and other local authority professionals are involved in giving information to the police and prevent officers, and that they don't have any knowledge of Islam or Muslims or the community. So that's something that was just off the back of what we heard. On that as well, if anyone is interested, please see me, take your details down. Don't feel like you just have to walk away and feel that you've played a part by sitting and attending. There are other ways for you to get involved, so please do reach out to us. When you speak to me at the end, take your name and details down, then we'll contact you in due course. If there's no other questions, we do need to wrap up. So what I'll do, I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you for attending. Thank you to those at home, and also thank you to our speakers, us from Coercion, Professor David Miller. And please do please do read the report if you've not read the report. There's a video summary for those of you who don't want to read the report. But I do suggest you do read the report. It's really insightful. It's the most significant thing that on the issue of prevent, I feel, for a long time. So all the information on the web, cage.ngo, and it's on our Twitter feed, so it's UK_cage, and on our social and on Facebook as well. So with all that, thank you very much to all of you, and good evening, and farewell. Simon.